Great. Hello and welcome to Developing Toronto, charting 20 years of change with the Chief Planner of the City of Toronto, Gregg Lintern, as well as the Managing Editor of UrbanToronto.com, or .ca rather, uh, Craig White. My name is Ash Navabi. I'm the economist at Urban Toronto, and I will be presenting some charts, which may be of part of the discussion later, but it'll help contextualize the event. So before we really get into it, let me just give some brief background on what is Urban Toronto. Urban Toronto is a one-of-a-kind website. We are in our 20th year of business. We have over 2 million page views per month from over 300,000 unique visitors. We are a news website, a forum, and a database service. Our news website, we have daily articles covering everything in the development industry, as well as a forum, very active forum, talking about everything related to development and more in the Greater Toronto area. About our forum, we have 40,000 registered users. And in our internal surveys, about 1 in 3 report that they work in the development industry in some way. We have several different forums. We have a buildings forum, which is our bread and butter, if you will. That's where people discuss the latest buildings, talk about the architecture, the planning, the construction, etc. We also have a real estate forum, which talks about floor plans and pricing and that kind of relationship. We also have a transportation forum, which they talk about transportation, obviously, and many more, including international forums and politics, etc. We get about 100 new threads in our forums a month. We have over 9,000 posts per month, and hundreds of images of construction as it's happening, which is very useful to both onlookers and people in the industry. UT Pro is our premier data service. So as many of you know, we do have free information, statistics available on our website. We have much more information behind our premium service, UT Pro. We track currently over 4,500 development applications across 12 different municipalities, from St. Catharines to Aurora to Bowmanville and everything in between, and even places like Guelph and Kitchener. We have descriptive information, quantitative information, as well as images of the buildings and the links to the development applications, as well as our forums, etc. So it makes tracking these applications very easy and very quickly. On to the charting part of this conversation. So here are some charts. The bottom line is that policy matters when it comes to development. This is a graph of development applications in pink and the number of units in blue throughout the year. So each black bar here represents January. And if you notice, there is a bump in applications, a big bump in applications every November, December, in anticipation of new application fees that come in every January. The gray bar here in the middle, there was a bump here in anticipation of inclusionary zoning, which was a Toronto policy that was actually reversed by the provincial government, or cut back actually, later on. But this was the city's deadline. All applications up to this point were excluded from inclusionary zoning, and so many people try to submit applications in anticipation of getting in front of that. This is a map of where development applications have come in over the last 4 years. As you see, the growth is not happening uniformly across the city. There are, of course, site-specific plans and other policies Toronto has to incentivize building in certain areas more than others. You'll notice that there's a lot of buildings here downtown, some along Eglinton here, and Finch and Shepherd, that way across along Yonge Street here. Not a lot of tall buildings happening in Ward 1 over there. Yeah, so this is very interesting map to look at in terms of where the growth is happening. And I should say, sorry, the heights here of these bars represent actually the heights of the buildings being proposed. Interest rates, federal policy also matters. So when the Bank of Canada started increasing rates last year, in March of last year, we noticed a significant drop in the number of units being built being proposed, every month. So applications got smaller ever since interest rates started to increase. And car parkings, that was another local citywide policy. Before the removal of parking minimums, which happened in December of 2021, before that, you can see there was a lot of variation month to month over how many parking spaces per unit were being proposed. After that, the variation got much narrower, and many months the average per unit car parking space per unit was below 1. This is with respect to building permits as well. So this is tracking shoring permits. Shoring is when you are digging below the ground and you need to put up some structures to prevent the walls from falling in on you. Development charges are the fees that developers have to pay whenever they're building new units. Those are paid upon receiving of construction permits, building permits. And you can see in May of 2023, the new higher development charges were coming in. There was a big rush of permits being applied for in anticipation of getting ahead of that. And this should be our last graphic here, is that since the pandemic, there have been a steadily declining number of, declining area of office space being proposed every month. So still a lot of variance in the early years, but as the years have gone by, we're getting fewer and fewer, or less and less office GFA being proposed in terms of square feet month over month. And now onto the main event. I'd like to introduce Craig White, the managing editor of UrbanToronto.ca. Craig has been with the company for 13 years now. He oversees and personally edits virtually every article that goes up. Again, we do dozens of articles per week. And before this, Craig was the chief cartographer of a company called MapArt. Gregg Lintern is the chief planner and executive director of city planning at the City of Toronto. He's been in city planning for 44 years. And I'm sure he's going to have a lot of interesting things to say in response to Craig's questions, as well as your questions that come up later. And with this is the end of my talk here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ash. It's 20 years now that Urban Toronto is celebrating. If anyone's been on our front page in the last while, you'll see that every day we are comparing old photos of Toronto with current ones in a then and now section, and we're finding another aspect of Urban Toronto's history over the last while and the city's history to celebrate. And we thought that during this month, in conjunction with these webinars that we're now doing quarterly, that there was nobody better to ask to come on to talk about 20 years worth of Toronto than Toronto's current chief planner, Gregg Lintern. So Gregg, we're really happy to have you with us today. Planning covers a vast scope of things that go on in Toronto. And I think there are a lot of people that expect that actually planning has control over much more than it actually does. But as we look back on 20 years of changes on the city that we love and hate, back and forth, mostly love, Uh, I'm wondering if you can bring us, give us an idea of what has happened in that sort of 20-year time frame with planning in this city, and what you would highlight out of the various changes that are going on, and so many of which seem to be happening right now.
Thanks a lot, Craig. I'll just say that it's 40 years, not 44. So you're getting ahead of yourselves. And I also wanted to just congratulate your firm. I think the Urban Toronto is, I know you're a for-profit enterprise, but you're providing a great public service, and I think all the planning nerds and all the urbanists out there really appreciate the the hard work, the diligent work, the very current and up-to-date information that you guys seem to pump out every day. I don't know how you do it, but congratulations on your 20 years. A lot has changed, and I was thinking about 20 years, and look, we have a lot of newcomers in Toronto, so some people may not know some of this, but 20 years ago, or maybe 23 years ago, you could play golf on City Place. There was a golf course on City Place. You could, they were making cookies at Mr. Christie over by Park Lawn. The Globe and Mail was being printed or at least being written. I don't know if they're printing press. I think their printing presses were still there on Front Street at Spadina, right downtown. They were making -8s or -7s at Downsview, Bombardier and de Havilland, its precursor. And the list goes on and on. You could rent a 1-bedroom for under $1,000. You could buy a house for $222,000. You could get on the TDC for under $2, $1.90. And Twitter wasn't so mean and nasty as it is now today. So, and we were just transitioning in 2003 from Lastman to Miller. So from a city politics point of view. So a lot has changed. And in that period of time, 312,000 housing units have been built in the city of Toronto. 312,000. So everybody who's probably listening to this webinar, that's a big amount of change, and it's a big number, especially when you look at what's been happening across North America. A lot of that, as your map showed, happens in a certain pattern. And I guess one thing I'd emphasize is that in 2003, we had just finished up, the city was amalgamated in 98, and we had just finished up in 2003, what we call the new official plan. So it's a new roadmap, a 30-year growth strategy for the newly formed city of Toronto. And it's kind of interesting, and you and I were talking in prep for this about kind of wondering, well, what's going on with our performance against the official plan? Most of the growth that's happened in the city has happened where the official plan said it should happen. And there's been lots of debate since then about the consequences of that, both beneficial and the challenges that growth pattern has developed or has led to. But it's interesting. There's a lot of other trends that have been washing over the city. One is there are more people now living in a building with more than 4 floors than people living in a building with less than four floors or less. We have become, despite any bias that people have, we have become a mid-rise and a high-rise city by default, just by the fact that most new housing units get built in a vertical form. More Torontonians are foreign born than not. there was a long pause in construction of transit that we've all kind of paid the price for. And the city, and you've seen the climate change over the last 20 years, the city is probably not as green as it needs to be when it comes to adapting to climate change. So how are we doing, against that OP vision? I would say good, but the consequences of some of the historic patterns and historic decisions that we made are catching up to us. Certainly the challenge that we've all got now around housing supply, the challenge that we've got around housing affordability, call it a crisis, and the map that you showed, the uneven growth. Some areas, and I often speak about this, are really hot, and they see a lot of real estate development, and they have a lot of infrastructure pressure attached to them, and stuff is happening in a way that we don't necessarily have a handle on getting all of the infrastructure for daily life that we would like. And on the other hand, some areas aren't seeing much activity at all, and their population in some areas has plateaued or declined. So that pattern of unevenness wasn't as present as it is now. And I think that's, looking forward, and we can discuss this today, looking forward, that presents a whole new set of challenges about how we deal with affordability, housing supply, and infrastructure.
I'm wondering how in this time planning is adapting to the kinds of development applications we're seeing, how those have changed over time, and how the working environment in your department has changed in the time that you've been there, how you're seeing that play out.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a multidisciplinary environment, just like it is on the development side of the table. We've certainly had more interest over the 20 years in, I would say, the quality of design, on sustainable design, the quality of public space, the emphasis that we put on the preciousness of public space in a way, because so many more people are living here. We have in the growth in the last 30 years, it's been 700,000 additional population or new population, and we anticipate that growth to be at least 700,000 looking forward 30 years. So the preciousness and the design of those communal spaces that we have becomes more and more important. Like the geography, is it 630 kilometers or whatever the number is of Toronto has not changed. So the utility of the space, the design of the space that we have to share, the access to that space, how it's connected for people to use. I mean, the Bentway is a fantastic example of finding a new way of thinking about precious space. That I was talking to somebody the other day about the Bentway and how when you look at the density of population around the Bentway, how dependent, and I have family living in City Place where they'll tell you they go down to the Bentway for when they get together with their friends. Their condo might be 700 square feet, but they're having that kind of resource nearby is so part of the transformation of how people live and experience the city. And the department reflects that. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's a space where we were seeing the odd comment on Urban Toronto saying, nobody's going to want to go down there. It'll be noisy. It'll be smelly. And all the things that it's turned out not to be, following its reinvention, essentially, and cleaning up and making it a found space that a lot of people now really cherish. And I suppose representative of the way that we're starting to look at every piece of the city as incredibly valuable, more than we might have thought at first. Years ago, nobody would have expected ever that a condo would go up between the Gardner Expressway and the off ramp at York Street, which has now been taken down. But there was a wedge of land there that nobody would have believed would have fit. I think it's a 600-unit building or so. Another Bentway type amenity in the to the east side of the city, this time under Eastern Avenue, Underpass Park, that was cleaned up, beautified with street art, and has become, a huge favorite for the skateboarding community, which was a community that was ignored at one point, which now I believe is also, we're catering to more types of people in tighter spaces than ever, and finding ways to make the city better.
Yeah, and it's a dynamic that's not just an urban thing. We've had these Plaza Pops happening out in Wexford in Scarborough, but also Albion and Islington and Rexdale. So we have small businesses getting together, working together in these locations, reimagining the parking lots in strip plazas and in small plazas. So it's the same kind of thing. You're thinking about space in a way that you never did. And we're not as really hung up about the fact that, there might be 5 or 10 parking spaces that get picked up by that new amenity. But for 2 or 3 weeks in the summer, when people can come together and gather, whether you live downtown or in the 416 suburbs, the whole idea of space is transforming, and the ideas that people are bringing to Toronto from other cities, and the way that they want to enjoy space and come together in public space. It's so important for, I like to say, social cohesion and civil society, that we do have places. In COVID, we're all locked up in our homes and our condos, and it really demonstrated the need to refocus on that. I mean, there were other knock-on effects from COVID, but that was just one of the reminders of how important all that is to the city's growth.
One of the areas where we've seen a lot of change in the way we approach land use is on the streets themselves, because we found that as you add people, you simply cannot transport them all by expecting them to be driving. And we're taking a number of our main streets and channelizing traffic more, vehicular traffic, and putting it on fewer lanes, and opening spaces for restaurants to spill out over the curb through the Cafe TO program, et cetera, for extending bikeways across the city. At the same time, we're also seeing pressure on our streets to build the new buildings that are going up these days, and the lanes that get taken up for construction projects. Can you talk to how your department is dealing with streets to a degree?
Yeah, I mean, we work really closely with transportation services, who are the asset, what we like to say, the asset manager or the asset owner of those streets. But the philosophy, if you think back 20 years and going forward, the philosophy is more around shared space and viewing the street as a complete street. I mean, I drive, I cycle, I walk, I take transit. And I think a lot of people probably on this webinar do all four. And what way can we make that street work better for all mobility? Is kind of the lens that we put it through. And what is the throughput when you add up the numbers? And it's a data-driven conversation in part. When you add up the numbers and you look at the throughput, if you rebalance that precious public space between those modes, you will have a higher performing street. And we saw that on King Street when we rebalanced the amount of space that was there and dedicated more to the effectiveness and efficiency of moving people on public transit and using some of the public space for, at the time we called it prosperity, but you're talking about people, prosperity, and movement as some of the defining criteria. And you see this on Bloor Street and the Danforth now, and other streets where we're rethinking, again, a very limited, I mean, those British soldiers who laid out that 66-foot chain length right of way for us, I curse them all the time, because it's, you know, you go to other cities and you see the wonderful width of some of their streets, and you have envy about that, because it's not a lot of space to work with. But I think we're getting there, and you know, people are seeing that there's not a lot of disbenefit. You know, that some of the business surveys that were done on Bloor, for example, and data-driven work that's done in other cities has demonstrated that business actually can flourish in these new environments, and it's not the boogeyman that people think it is. And I think we also have a plan. Like, we're not. It may appear that these things are happening randomly, but they're not. There's a cycling network plan, and that's advancing systematically, always subject to funding, but it's advancing systematically. And you know, when you couple that with a year or so ago, when we eliminated minimum parking requirements in the city, there's a recognition that people need to be supported in how they are not only moving around differently, but the effect of a whole regime that is based on the automobile. And you look back well beyond 20 years, but you look at the patterns of cities and how focused they were on the amount of space that a car takes up, the separation of land use, mobility that was car dependent, that whole shift that's been taking place, again, before, you know, during these last 20 years, but certainly looking back even further, we've been making a slow but steady shift toward a more mixed-use city, a more accessible city with the amount of public transit that's under construction, and a multimodal city that actually supports daily life, both when you choose to live locally and work locally, but also if you need to get around to different parts of the city.
Because we're touching on it now, I want to jump to one of the questions that one of our audience members has put in, and that is the whole removal of parking minimums. One of our audience asks, what's the thought to removing parking minimum? How can anyone expect people would survive without cars and visitors? And I think it's a little more complicated than just that. Can you speak to the city's overall plan for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a lot of consultation when we did this. We also did a lot of analysis. We found that I think it was around 75% of the rezonings that we were doing were already reducing the parking below the bylaw requirement. So we were already shifting toward a regime that was more market driven. Depends on, it's very location sensitive, and some developers will not want to build without parking, and some will want to build depending on the location and the product they're building. But recently toured some condo and market rental buildings down in the Distillery, and one of the developers was just reinforcing for me what we heard in that consultation, which is that the development of parking has become cost prohibitive to the development pro forma, and indirectly the whole. I don't think it's going to directly result in affordable housing, but it does all factor into the price and cost of housing. And if you're spending literally hundreds of thousands of dollars per space to build underground garages, you know, you're looking seriously at whether or not those projects are viable. It's not my area of expertise, but I think we did it because we were looking at the trend, more of a market-driven regime, and we were looking at the effect that was going to have on housing, and it's part of a whole suite. It's part of a whole suite of things that we've done with our very deliberately to make housing where possible, make housing supply come on stream.
Right. From our end, what we see is that developers have been saying they simply can't, or they weren't able to sell the number of parking spaces that were mandated under the zoning bylaws before. And that's why they were always, of course, applying to the department to decrease the number below the minimum, because parking garages were going partly empty and again, extremely expensive. And at the same time, there are fewer and fewer people, Gen X, I suppose, mostly, that simply aren't buying cars, and because the cars themselves are too expensive. And if you're locating in downtown or anywhere along major transit in Toronto, where the majority of our tall towers are, many of those people are now getting by without cars, and their visitors can also often get by without a car because they're so transit accessible to so many things. And there are still some parking minimums to a degree further out in the city. I don't know if we've ever seen a map exactly yet showing where out in the suburbs there are certain percentages that are still expected per suite.
No, I don't think so. But you know, this is turning into one of our typical public meetings, Greg, where we only talk about parking.
All right. Well, we will move on. We will. Yeah, I know that it's front and center in a lot of people's minds.
Yeah.
But let's then get into tall towers along major transit lines and gentle density in what's called the Yellow Belt. And for those who aren't familiar, who are watching, Toronto planner Gil Meslin coined the term the Yellow Belt in the last decade or so because zoning maps of Toronto and of many other cities identify areas where only single-family homes were allowed to be built, as you know, and which blanket these maps. I think the largest percentage of Toronto, I can't remember exactly the figure right now, is considered Yellow Belt through this zoning, and a major change was made this year to increase the density in those areas and take the pressure off just the major nodes along our avenues, our arterials where the rapid transit is, and allow more density in more parts of the city. And let's talk about all of that concentration along rapid transit lines and major roads and gentle density now.
Yeah, so you're kind of describing the two extremes, where for many years, and I talked about uneven growth earlier in our conversation about how some areas have seen all kinds of action and other areas they've been quite quiet, and part of that quiet has been around, as you said, the Yellow Belt. It's about 35% of our official plan map by geography is yellow. So in those areas, what we would call neighborhoods in the official plan, predominantly the zoning, which is the precision that goes with the vision of the official plan, the zoning was historic and related to zoning that was put down when those neighborhoods were built, and whether they be in the 50s, 60s, 70s through the post-war period. And they typically only permitted single detached dwellings. I don't use the word single family because everybody's living in different circumstances. So they're just single detached, one single unit dwellings. Sometimes there are subdivisions out in the in the 416 suburbs that are semis. There are some semi-detached subdivisions. People don't realize that, but there's a fair amount of that. But in any event, when we built tall towers back then, they were in clumps. They were done in clumps, and they were done in a planned way. And for the most part, these neighborhoods haven't changed. And our official plan policy for years was, I think the famous words are stable but not static. But there was certainly an emphasis on stable, not a lot of change. Very dependent on evaluating new homes based on how well they fit in with character and some of the wording in the official plan. So what we've done is recognize that, and this has been a trend line, I think, in other North American cities, and certainly here, the conversation is to retool the housing toolkit, and part of it has been, what can we do about ground-related housing? Because certainly we're building lots of towers, there's no question, but what about the neighborhoods? Is there a way to provide more access to more people across greater locations, give them more choice than they've had before? The power of zoning. This is an example of the power of zoning, because over time, together with land value, those neighborhoods have become more exclusive. They have excluded people from being able to live in certain parts of the city just by the virtue of the price point of those homes, or the fact that units weren't available to rent because the zoning didn't permit second units. So, over time, whether it be income or race segregation has crept into the way that we look in the city, and I think we have also not done a good turn by the climate by depending more on sprawl for ground-related units than we have about building within our existing footprint. So to wrap all that up, we have introduced through a program called Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods, we have introduced a range of new permissions. Secondary suites are now permitted as of right. Laneway suites, if you have a laneway. A garden suite, if you don't have a laneway, we just call it a garden suite, but it's an accessory dwelling unit. And then last year, or earlier this year, we introduced multiplex, which is as of right 4 units. Remember, there are no parking minimums, so you can build these housing units and not have to build parking. If you don't want, if you're building a unit and you have a 3-car driveway, then that's great, because you'll be able to market that unit based on having a parking space. But the whole idea is to expand choice for Torontonians, both existing and new, expand choice into areas of the city that have previously been exclusive, and to really make the city more inclusive and ultimately climate adaptive, because we're building on our own footprint. We're going to be able to age in place more easily. We can maybe, choose to locate, if you're a newcomer, in a neighborhood that's close to a shopping street, or maybe there's a school that's being threatened with closure, but because more people are moving into that neighborhood, it will no longer be threatened with closure. So the whole ecosystem of urban life, I think, is supported by just making this choice and these options available to more people in more places. And that's been a big thrust of the last couple of years, is to get past some of the old rules, which when you really ask yourself the hard question, if we don't change, are we going to get the same results? And I don't think the same results are good enough anymore when it comes to the way the city has to respond to the pressures that we're under for housing and climate and being a more inclusive city. So we have to change it up. And that means, changing people's minds. And I often talk to people about, the first question I'll ask is, where are your kids going to live? Are you interested in that topic? If they've got kids, they're very interested in that topic, or their friends or their family. Maybe it's their cousin coming from overseas. Where are they going to live? And it's a big personal worry for so many people. And these are areas where we can just get after that and make some serious changes to the way things can happen in the city, and I think for the better.
One word you used a couple of minutes ago in regards to this, stable neighborhoods, I think is something that's poorly understood by a lot of people, and they'll see an area that was developed, in older parts of the city in the 1930s, and straight gridded tree-lined streets, beautiful old homes. Further out in North York, Scarborough, Etobicoke, you have the winding roads of the neighborhoods that were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And the trees have all grown tall there as well. And people sort of understand this word stable, I think, very often in terms of the buildings that are actually there, but they don't understand that at the same time that the buildings may be stable in a certain neighborhood, that the population of that neighborhood is dropping. Because when a neighborhood is new, typically get families with young children moving in, and as the neighborhood ages, so do the kids, and the kids eventually move out, and the population of a house that at one point had 4 people in it suddenly has 2 eventually, or whatever the number was, and averaged out and multiplied over many streets in the neighborhood. The number of people go down, and schools are threatened with closure. Something else you mentioned, that's probably the most visible sign of neighborhood population decline, and it gets to the point where the neighborhood actually is not stable, and that for us to be able to maintain services and affordable housing for people, we've had to look at more ways to get more housing into these maybe misnamed stable neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, my citation is more around words that are in the official plan, and the reference, generally speaking, is about the physical characteristics of the city, of those neighborhoods. But you're quite right. The stability, if you think about it more broadly, population decline there's nothing really stable about them. So I would agree with your characterization of that. I think another area, Craig, that we're looking at is how to expand the suite of choices, if you will, for and a lot of this isn't about the big development companies, but it's more about the smaller builders and the smaller investors, and even what I would call citizen developers who want to look at a piece of property differently for their own families, but also maybe they're adding a unit or 2, or maybe they want to build a small apartment building or some row houses. The format of housing types it's undergoing a metamorphosis. I think there's a lot more hybrid forms. So I don't want to get caught too much on terminology. It's just housing units. But I think we're going to see, looking forward, a real, I think, interesting period of time where architects and designers are going to get after this and look at bringing different typologies to housing solutions. And they'll be greener, and they'll still offer outdoor space and amenities for residents, but they'll do it more creatively in order to land more units on the properties that they're looking at. Maybe on a main street, the major road work that we're in consultation about right now is looking at small assemblies, and we're trying to tie feasibility, and we're testing this feasibility. We've always been testing feasibility on the EHON projects because we don't want to put zoning in place that doesn't really work or doesn't provide at least a reasonable basis of working. So we're testing, how many units could you make, would you need to make it work at a certain scale? How many lots? So we're looking at that just to make sure that what we do come forward with, I mean, it's not going to be the big, some of this work is going to be about the fact that the city will still be constructed and change at different scales. Low, medium, high-rise scales will still be probably what the city has always been about and will continue to be about. But and not every area is necessarily suitable for just throwing down 30, 40, and 50-story towers everywhere. But thinking about areas that could accommodate, for example, 6-story buildings on major roads is something that we're looking really seriously about, and been out in consultation about that this month, actually.
And is that part of a reevaluation of the Midrise Guidelines, or is this a separate?
Yeah, I mean, it relates a little bit to one of the built form considerations, which is hotly debated on your platform, which is these pyramid wedding cake guidelines that we have. I think that we've tabled ideas around changing that from mid-rise on avenues, which are in our mixed use areas, and that's generally buildings between 5 and 11 stories, and looking at different ways of transitioning instead of just through an angular plane. And those ideas have been out to public consultation, and we're coming back to committee about some changes to the urban design guidelines that will offer alternatives to transition than the angular plane.
We should maybe just explain that a little bit, that buildings on smaller assemblies on main roads currently are required to follow sort of a terracing effect to minimize shadow and overlook on adjacent properties. They often back on to a single dwelling unit properties that are often 2 or 3 stories tall, etc. And there are questions about that currently. But you're looking at a second sort of area there as well. Context.
The guideline is more about the fact that we should move away from this wedding cake angular plane approach. It will manifest itself in different parts of the city, though. In neighborhoods where we're looking at, for example, 6 stories on major roads, they would not be required to have an angular plane. On avenues in mixed use areas, same thing. We would be moving away from angular plane to a different approach to transition between the streets, the development on the main street and or the avenue and the neighborhood. I think a principle that's important is that we are still a winter city. We still have shoulder seasons. I was out on Queen Street on Sunday, and it was a beautiful sunny day. But we're getting into the shoulder season, so it was nice to be able to enjoy some sunlight on the public space, the public sidewalk. So we're still looking to make sure that we still have some good sunlight and pedestrian comfort on our public spaces. But I think the transition between different built forms, that's what we're looking at changing so that we have a better balance of objectives. I think another area that might be of interest to your readers, Craig, is just the whole effect of COVID on some. We talk about housing a lot and some of the other housing solutions, and I'll just quickly mention a couple that are really in flight, and you often report on them. One is the fact that we have so many single-purpose mall sites across the city. And they're a vestige of the old way of doing things with car-dependent separated land uses. And we've got about 19, I think it is, applications across the city right now for redevelopment of malls into mixed use centers, introducing public streets, new parks, new amenities. I think it's about, if I got my numbers right, it's about 69,000 residential units in those 19 applications. So that in of itself is really transformative. And that's something that you'll notice going forward in the next 20 years is how different the city will begin to look. Another area of interest, I'm sure, is the what's called the Transit-Oriented Communities Program from the province. And the TOC program is an initiative of the province to actually build transit in a way that actually can support development on the same site as the transit. We've seen on Eglinton that the development of the transit was not conceived to include development above the station. And the way that the Ontario line is being planned by the province is to actually incorporate development with those station locations. So when Metrolinx has to buy up land or lease land to develop their station facilities, they will take the land, but then they'll go back out to compete to competition for those sites. So we're going to see a lot of transformation through their TOC program of getting actual density and development around transit stations. We want to make sure we get some affordable housing out of that deal. And one of the conversations we're having with the province is how much affordable housing we can get out of those TOCs, because I really don't think Toronto's having much of a problem with building a lot of market housing. It's never enough, but the actual sweet spot for us is affordable housing and making sure that we have some levers to pull so that we can meet the needs of people who aren't getting housing out of the market supply. And think about, I always think about housing through a lens of income. And if you think about the store clerk or the PSW or other people who have housing need in the city, is our housing supply meeting their need? It's not, because the market is not building truly affordable housing. So there has to be more of a role for affordable housing initiatives, funding programs, and other ways of achieving affordable housing. It's a real gap, and it's probably the biggest challenge the city has right now.
There's along with applications to remake 19 malls or so as multi-purpose communities. There are also occasionally applications to switch industrial land over to residential or mixed use. And the city has had years, obviously, of wanting to protect that because it protects jobs in the city as well. But there's a more nuanced approach to that too, I believe. And we also have somebody asking as well how the transitions between neighborhoods and industrial areas or at least new neighborhoods and industrial may be affected by all these new applications.
Yeah, I mean, employment lands are, I've called them recently the jobs belt as opposed to the green belt. 400,000 jobs in our employment area. I don't think anybody wants the city to become just a place where people live. I know that sounds like hyperbole, but that's the threat that we're under, because the land value of employment lands is lower. It's easier to afford, and the threat of new residential development in an employment area is such that it might put those other employment uses out of business because of their environmental operating certificates. So we guard those areas. It's only, I think, 12% of the city's land area. It's a very comparatively small area. We do not need to convert our employment lands to achieve our housing goals. We certainly need to continue to densify on land that where residential is permitted, but we don't need to cross over the line and start carving up our employment areas. It really has a knock-on effect for a lot of people who spend a lot of money on their factories and on their facilities in our employment areas. They want that long-term certainty about their investment. If you're asking somebody to spend $200 or $300 million on a new processing facility. They want to know that they're going to be there for 10 years and not be threatened by a condo going up next door. So it's a delicate balance, but again, there's lots of room in the city for other residential development, and we see that with all of the other policy changes that we're making.
I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought there for a moment. Right, I'm going to go to another question. We're down to about 5 minutes here. There are far more questions than we can answer. Just looking through here. Let's see. Somebody's asking if the number or the size of a dwelling unit and the number of people in it has, like the ideal number has changed over time. And I suppose what they're getting at here is, as Toronto is densifying, do we, are we targeting particular numbers, or maybe this person is feeling hemmed in? Is there anything that the department looks at in terms of how many people should be in certain areas? How do you calculate that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think demographically, the city over time has seen smaller household sizes, more households, but smaller per person. So where we may have been in a place where we had 2.5 or 3 people per household, now we might be in the 1.7 people per household. So when we do a planning framework for an area, we will look at population projections for that area. We'll look at demographic profiles. We'll look at how many children and how many elderly people might be living there or projected to live there. And then we'll assess the community needs of that area. So if we know that we're expecting a lot of family-size housing with a lot of kids coming, we better make sure that we're planning for a community center, for example, or a new school. So we do look at that when we do these planning frameworks. I would say that there's no ideal; it's more data driven.
Okay, and I'm seeing another question here that sort of ties into that. We have somebody asking regarding the high density residential zones and then the shadows that some of the towers create. Is there any policy to protect, if not influence, the increase of green space and home-based gardening, keeping in mind there may be up to 3 families per residential lot and increasing need for family cost saving gardens plus the environmental impact? So somebody is essentially asking about, as more and more people end up in the same amount of areas, how do we have enough space for recreation, for growing food, things like that? How's that balanced?
Yeah, I think the word is balance. We need more housing. There's no question about it. How quickly that housing will transition in the neighborhoods, I think it's going to happen over time. The whole question of compatibility between areas of different scale. I think what we've been proposing in neighborhoods is generally compatible with what we're seeing on major streets, whether they be 6 stories on a major road in a neighborhood or 5 to 11 stories on an avenue, or in other areas, taller buildings. And it's ultimately, like anything in planning, it's trade-offs. Trade-offs are made around the impact of development and the desirability of the development, and making sure that on balance, the number of objectives that we have in the official plan are addressed. I would say that more often than not, we really have to consider how we are improving our housing numbers. It's a challenge to make sure that we've struck that right balance, and especially if we have an opportunity for affordable housing.
And thank you for that. We have a lot of questions unanswered. I'm going to see if we have a way of well, we'll copy a number of them. We'll see if Mr. Lintern and or anyone else in the planning department might have time to answer some of these in another format. Obviously, a lot of people are thirsty for knowledge, all sorts of nitty-gritty type things, as well as the more conceptual ones. I'm sorry that we're about to lose our live feed now. We just don't have time to answer anymore right now, but we will see what we can do about getting some answers to these questions to everybody. We really thank you for coming along and watching today, and we thank Mr. Lintern for his time and the ability to talk about a lot about what's going on in Toronto at the moment. And you and I, Greg, we didn't even get through all the things we talked about.
No.